Welcome to Seek Justice, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the nuances of criminal justice. Good morning, Dennis.
Good morning, Eric.
So, last time we talked about unintended consequences and how sometimes you can try and do one thing and another, it's like whack-a-mole, another thing pops up. And you mentioned that today you wanted to talk to me about something that's going on in Alabama.
Well, the story of unintended consequences, as we discussed last week, can happen at the local level when nonprofits are attempting to do a good job, work with people who otherwise probably wouldn't have gone to prison, perhaps, even though they espouse to be an alternative to incarceration. And then when the people who are caught up in their program fail in the program, they do go to prison. And so the unintended consequence is that you're actually increasing the recidivism rate. The situation in Alabama is much more system-oriented, and it's just the latest example of how a state can enter into a short couple years of reforms that will reduce the size of their prison population with a promise of reinvestments from savings. And the unintended consequence is that the savings don't materialize, or the savings aren't applied to the justice system. Instead, they're applied for much more politically attractive things such as roads and education. Right. And as a result, things change. And as I'll describe a little bit in Alabama, you've got all sorts of trouble. And it is all around this thing of, geez, what do you intend? How do you intend to do it? And you got to really plan for the end game in mind very, very specifically, or as the situation that we've described many, many times, is it's like trying to capture Jello with a chicken wire. You squeeze one end, it comes out the other end. It's very, very hard to capture it unless you're very all hands on deck and very complete in your approach.
Okay, so what was attempted in Alabama, and how did it fail, and what's newsworthy about it at the moment?
Well, the federal government has found through the courts that the Alabama prison system is not constitutionally sound. It's unsafe. It's deplorable conditions, and you or the readers can look at a news report that came out 5 or 6 days ago that lays out these deplorable conditions. But this follows a series of reforms in Alabama that promised significant reinvestments based on savings. And apparently, one of the places that they didn't put whatever savings to materialize was not in addressing the conditions in the prison system. And here's the unintended consequence, is that not only the as I've stated several times on previous podcasts, is that this promise of savings is false to begin with. This goes beyond that, way beyond that, in that if reforms are successful, as they were in Alabama, to reduce the size of the prison population and the makeup of the prison population, so that, as many reformists will say, I'm not one of them, that we'll focus on nonviolent offenders, and we don't want them in prison, which I'm not saying I disagree with that, but I don't want to stop with nonviolent. I want to look at people's risk level, whether they're violent or nonviolent, and
right.
work through that. But what ends up happening is the prison system ends up being a much more dangerous place. Once you remove from the prison system those folks that are on the low end of risk, you end up with a higher proportion, obviously, of people that are on the violent end of the spectrum. And as a result of that, the makeup of the prison system changes, and it affects all sorts of things in terms of staffing, the amount of noncompliance at the prisoner level, altercations between prisoners, altercations between guards and staff as a ratio. Right. They begin to increase.
Right, exactly. It's not that if you take away all the nonviolent inmates that you need more staff. It's that you need more staff proportionally, because you've concentrated the more violent. The ratio of violent to nonviolent has gone up.
Right. So the skill set for the correctional officers is different. And using South Carolina as another example, which is probably about a year ago, they had predicted riots in the prison system, and it followed years of reforms that ended up doing the same exact thing I'm talking about here. It reduced the number of nonviolent people in prison, and then over time, because the prisons became more dangerous, and coupled with a great decrease in the unemployment rate, so the jobs were more plentiful, the job of being a correctional officer became much, much harder for the state to fill. Danger, pay level, et cetera.
Right,
so
sure.
as a result, folks who worked in the prison system, who I met with months before this happened, said that it was a powder keg. So they didn't make a law in South Carolina, and I'm sure that's what happened in Alabama as well, a law that said when there's savings that are found as a result of the reforms, they must be reinvested in improvement in the system, whether that be parole officers, correctional officers, whatever. It didn't make that happen, and as a result, it was the decision of the legislature not to reinvest and instead to spend the money elsewhere. And there was an article that we could find easily enough that actually related this situation exactly to these reforms, and the press got it right. And it just all gets back to these promises that are made by policymakers, in this case, the Charitable Trust, the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Both of them, I think, were involved in both of these places. It could be one or the other. I'd have to check into it. But they went in not having a very deep and distant plan for, what would transpire if they were successful. And unintended consequences then took over.
So the bit that's unconstitutional is that part of the Constitution that talks about cruel and unusual punishment. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. You can't run a prison system that is so dangerous that people are constantly in fear of their lives, and there's extensive violence and rape and things of that nature, drug smuggling, et cetera. And all you have to do is look at the rate of violent incidences, inmate to inmate or inmate to correctional officer, et cetera, to see how a prison system is becoming more dangerous.
Right.
Amount of confiscated goods. I mean, there's a lot of data out there that when you start to track it, you can see the early signs of this very, very easily. You don't have to just rely on the gut feeling of folks, which is good. The gut feelings are generally pretty solid on this, because you can feel what a prison feels like when you walk into it, whether it is highly charged or less charged.
Interesting.
It's hard to explain it, but all prisons are not the same.
So I guess there's plenty of precedent as to exactly what cruel means and what unusual means. Is it obvious when a prison crosses that line, or is it pretty fuzzy and you need persuasive lawyers to get involved?
Well, lawyers are always involved one way or the other. The Departments of Correction all have lawyers, and they're constantly being sued for what happens inside a prison. And one of the untold stories that we might dig into, I'd have to find a lot more facts on this before I would talk too much about it. But you start to see incidents of violence go up. You start to see drugs being moved into the prisons go up. And it creeps up on a prison system over time. Often what happens is an event that is quite obvious and can't be ignored, because there's a prison riot, there's a murder. In Delaware, where I've worked, there was a riot there. The governor was involved. They stormed the prison. One of the correctional officers were killed. Well, when the report was written about Delaware, and I'm sure this is the case in South Carolina, it will be the case in Alabama, these reports might be subtitled, "Why did we ignore the science?"
Huh.
Why did we ignore the people who told us this? It's always that thing, right, where hindsight's 20/20.
Exactly. Yep.
And so it's not so subtle. I've been in a lot of prisons all over the country, and you can generally get a pretty good idea of prisons being operated just by how the inmates interact with you, whether they're wide open or suspicious, what the kind of what the temperature, the personal temperature is in the prison, whether folks are confident and friendly. May sound strange, But if you're in a prison where the inmates are coming up to you and talking to you and
Yeah.
they're interacting with each other and they're respectful, there's a vibe, right? You walk into another joint, and it's going to be very different. So these things often they range from subtle to obvious, but it's never a mystery when it happens.
Yeah, I imagine the nonverbal, body language and stuff is got to be when you first walk in the door and see the way the guy guarding the front door is, his posture probably tells you a lot about.
There's a lot, and it was hard for me when I was deputy director of the prison system in Michigan. It was somewhat embarrassing to walk into a prison and then all the guards would yell, deputy secretary on the floor, and that yell would, filter up through the bays and the cells and whatnot. And it was always like, can I just kind of come in? And the answer's no. But yeah, I remember one prison.
And is that to be like, hey, everybody, be on your best behavior. Put down whatever you were doing. The boss is here.
Yeah. Stand attention.
Yeah.
It's respectful as well, I suppose. But I was in a prison in Michigan once that had been going through some very dramatic changes of prisoner preparation for release through prisoner reentry, and they had been working for quite some time to change their programming, and even the housing was different. Everything was different, and I went into the prison long before this trip I'm talking about, and it was the difference between day and night. And it was all about those kind of subtleties that you mentioned, the way that people look at you and how tense or comfortable they are,
right?
How much they smile, how much they interact. At the second time I went into prison, I had inmates come up to me and, hello, sir, and shake my hand and look at me square in the eye.
Yeah.
And the time before I went there, none of that would take place. And you could just feel it throughout the joint. And I remember they were showing me around, of course. I went into a room where there were some of the surliest, biggest, meanest looking guys, right?
Yeah.
And they were all hunkered over these tables, and they were making teddy bears.
Awesome.
And it was so strange
to see
these guys all tatted up and woolly and big, and then making their teddy bears. And when I interrupted, of course, as I would when I walk in, and asked them how they were doing, they were very verbal. And one guy expressed to me that this work he was doing was the most important thing he'd ever done in his life.
Wow.
And I said, well, that's a big deal. I mean, why is that? He says, it's the first time I've ever done anything for anybody.
Yeah.
I've never done anything for anybody. It's all been me. And just to know that this is helping some kid in the hospital somewhere it's very moving stuff,
Sure.
It puts the prisoners in a more of a human perspective, where, a lot of different folks will describe prisons in a lot of different ways, everything from treating them like animals in cages, which is, not necessarily much the case in my experience, treating them like animals per se, but nonetheless, they are locked up and it is small and confined, and it may be cramped, and it may or may not be clean.
Right.
If you walk into a prison and the prison isn't spotless, you're taken aback with all that free labor.
Yeah, exactly.
It better be clean. Even, I was in a prison in Texas, and it was so old, and just these old metal bars everywhere, and the paint all chipping, but it was spotless. And every prisoner in the place was dressed in bright white, spotless clothes.
Nice.
And we're respectful. And when touring it, you could see why. I mean, there was programming everywhere. People were busy.
Yeah.
And the saying, what is it? The idleness is something about the devil's handshake. I can't remember what it is. Idleness is the devil's workshop or something like that. Or
exactly.
Idle hands or evil hands or whatever. And it's really true in a system like that. I mean, you asked me a lot of questions over time about data. There's data that you can use to show this.
It reminds me, it seems analogous to nursing homes, where there's a lot of programs and activities to do all the time. The people are a lot happier and do better. And then there are other ones that are pretty much like locking animals in cages. I had never seen the equivalence between nursing homes and prisons before, but there are some.
Yeah.
So you mentioned free labor, and that seems like a sort of a moral issue of how. I mean, you've got a bunch of people there that can't leave, and do you give them jobs? And if you do you pay them? And how much do you pay them? And if you don't pay them, doesn't that sound an awful lot like slavery? There's a lot of issues here. That
yeah, well,
I mean, I didn't mean to drop the slave card yet quite so early, but talk to me about the free. Talk to me about how prisons manage free. The idea of labor, having a workforce that can be employed.
Well, let's start with that point of slavery. You're familiar with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which outlawed slavery, which most students in grade school, 8th grade, high school, will know that it outlawed slavery. What a lot of folks don't know is exactly what that says, and it says that it outlawed unpaid servitude, unless the person was a convicted felon locked up in a prison system.
Uh-huh.
There's some words to that effect. And so the matter is that slavery is not against the law totally in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery is allowed in the prison system.
So,
and
right.
Yeah.
So
and so you get paid a penny a day. Some pay a penny an hour. And if you smoke cigarettes, which some prisons have outlawed now, by the way, those cigarettes aren't going to cost you any less. I quit smoking 30 years ago, so I don't know what they cost anymore. I think they're probably pretty expensive, $6-8 a pack. Well, figure out how many pennies that is and how many days it would take you to buy a pack of cigarettes, and you get the idea of what the economic disparity is between, the payment of slave wages, which frankly could be no wages,
right.
And then the expense of stuff that the prison system isn't going to give you, cigarettes. You got to buy your own, obviously.
So it's like.
But here's.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, here's the other fact to add to that. There's something called an idleness rate, and that is a ratio of prisoners who are busy at any given time.
Okay.
And the general rule is that if your idleness rate starts to creep up much beyond 10, 12, or even hits a high of 15%, you're likely to have trouble. Because prisoners, anybody, I shouldn't pick on prisoners per se, but if somebody's not keeping you busy, you will keep busy.
Right.
You will busy yourself. And when you're in a prison and you're locked up with a bunch of criminals, the odds are pretty good that some of the stuff that you're up to is not legal.
Uh-huh.
And so you've got to keep people busy or it starts to get dangerous. And so there's data then that is one of the signs when you're thinking about Alabama, South Carolina, Delaware. Be interesting for anybody to go in and look at the idleness rates when they start to say it's starting to feel a little tense in here, and you've got there's all sorts of punishments in the prison system where people get locked down. They aren't allowed out of their cell except for an hour a day. Tension rise. You're in a cell with another guy, another two men perhaps. Good Lord. I mean, there's you wonder why there isn't a riot every day. I mean,
wow. Yeah.
It's amazing. And the ratio of correctional officers to prisoners is another important piece of data. And depending on how the prison is constructed, whether there's open bays where a lot of men sleep in one area, whether there's closed cells, single cell, double cells, whatever, makes a big difference. Where you can see what you can't see, et cetera. The newer prisons are constructed with almost like an octopus with the correctional officers in the center of a hub and the wings spreading out from there so you can have sight,
right.
unfettered sight down the line. All these things come into play. So keeping prisoners busy in a lot of respects means giving them jobs that aren't particularly meaningful. I saw one guy in a woodworking shop, I'll never forget this, where young guy, and his job was to sweep. Well, he would never be done.
Right.
He would never be done, and he would never catch up. It was in a shop of some kind of, I think it was sawdust everywhere.
Sure.
And I just thought, wow, what a thankless job that would be. But he was happy to be busy.
Yeah.
He said the days go along. So when I talked to him, he was making a penny a day or something like that. Other places you go, I've been in Angola prison down in Louisiana, how they work people there and how that prison is run is pretty remarkable with the number of prisoners that they have, particularly lifers. Now think about that. You've got a prison where guys are going through programming and they're being rehabilitated, so to speak, or habilitated, and they're motivated because they're going to get out.
Right.
Well, what if you're in prison for life and there's no chance of parole? What's that?
Yeah.
Why would you put those people through programming
Exactly.
if it's going to help them with a skill when they get out? And so they don't get a lot of programming, and yet those are the men who perhaps need some response to their idleness more than anybody else.
Sure.
And it's very, very difficult for them. And we see a lot of programs all throughout prison systems throughout the country where those lifers are put to use as volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
If they have any kind of a skill, that skill can be taught to other prisoners.
Huh.
If they can read, they can be tutors, et cetera. I mean, you really
Right.
you got to take a completely different view when you're a warden, particularly a smart, informed warden who's kind of drank the rehabilitation Kool-Aid, so to speak, to be creative about these kinds of things.
Sure. So is there any data to show whether paying prisoners more for their time has any effect? Like maybe they want to, their room and board is taken care of, but maybe they want to help support their family on the outside or something. Is there any are people more motivated, or are there better outcomes or less recidivism or something if you pay them, a couple $1 an hour rather than pennies?
Well, I'm sure there is data, and I'm sure there's reports. I know from my personal experience, a very good example of this is when I was in Kansas working in the prison system there. I was in this prison that was built. I think Abraham Lincoln was president when it was built.
Huh?
It was that old and ancient, huge, sprawling place. And I can't remember the circumstances, but I was treated with some deference and was on a tour. And we left one building, and the correctional officer, said something to me about, "You're not going to believe this." And I said, "What?" He said, "Well, you see those big metal doors down there? That's where we're going. I want to show you something."
Uh-huh.
We go into these doors, and we walk into a factory. And this factory is embroidering sweatshirts and hats with college, university symbols.
Right.
Words, names, pictures, etc. And it is a beehive of activity. And there are sewing machines going everywhere. Doesn't take you long to see. This is a well-run factory. Production was just, you could see it happening before you.
Yeah.
And everywhere, there's needles and box cutters and all sorts of stuff.
Right.
So I spent a bit of time there interviewing prisoners, talking to them, and correctional officers. Well, in that prison system, which organized their in-house work center so long ago that chambers of commerce were not organized well enough to outlaw, as many states have done, work in prison that competes with what happens in the free world.
Right.
It's a law in many, many states that you cannot compete. That's why they busy themselves making license plates and ashtrays out of old license plates instead of manufacturing shirts.
Right.
Or anything, right? I mean, you've got labor, so you could understand how the capitalist market would kind of be abhorred by this. But here, they had organized before any of that happened because this work-centered idea had been in Kansas before most prison systems.
Interesting.
But interviewed a man who was in for life. They were being paid a living wage, not minimum wage, a living wage. They were being paid more than a minimum wage. They were making enough money that they were paying for their room and board in the prison. They were sending money home, and this prisoner, who I never asked him what they've done, but he'd done something serious, obviously.
Yeah.
He'd been in for life, and he was so proud. He put 2 kids through college. He sends home money every month for his wife. He pays his own room and board.
Wow.
And he was just so proud. Now, I will tell you this, and that's coupled then, which is important. If you want to have an impact afterwards, you've got to do something about it. I mean, earning a living wage in prison or minimum wage or better wage in prison is one thing, but if they get out and there's nothing there, then you're right back to where you were. So they also had a program to place inmates in jobs based on their skill level. And so it was a good yin-yang kind of inside-outside. The research says you should have whatever you do in the inside that's good, continue it, 3 times as much in the outside.
That makes perfect sense.
So, yeah, I mean, I could dig in and find the studies that would show this, but you just know from an individual level how much better it is. Yeah.
So you just mentioned that he was paying his room and board. That normally you don't how are there some prisons where you can or must do that? I was under the impression that the state is paying for all of that.
Well, that's the right impression. I mean, the state is, in fact, almost all places completely paying for it, unless, of course, you've got the circumstance. If you're paying people a penny a day, we're not going to charge them room and board.
But if you're paying them a good wage, but what if you, what if you, lose that job? I mean, you're not going to not be able to pay rent.
No, it's tied to the job.
Yeah, right.
It's tied. So it comes out of your paycheck, and and I had asked in Kansas, has there ever been any problems with weapons, et cetera? Because the whole place is, everywhere you look, there's a weapon,
right?
Potential weapon, and you can walk into any prison, and they will have a little display case somewhere that shows proves the creativity of prisoners, albeit with weapons.
Yeah.
What they make into weapons, everything from a toothbrush that's been sharpened against a brick,
right,
and then used as a shiv.
Yeah.
To taking your shoes apart, and some shoes have got a metal shank in them that you can use for a knife, et cetera.
Wow.
But here, a prisoner, it was either a prisoner or correctional officer who'd been there for 20 some years, said in all that time they had had one lockdown because there was a box cutter missing. And of course, the key to this is, keeping track of everything. I mean,
sure.
You pick your tools up, you sign out for them, et cetera.
Right.
And the whole prison was shut down until the prisoners found the prisoner that took the box cutter and turned it in.
Huh.
Because those prisoners were motivated. They needed to go to work the next day.
Right. So,
and the prisoners run the prison system in a large extent anyway. That's perhaps a whole nother discussion. But it's important when you've got ratios of one correctional officer to 10, 15, 20, 30, 60, 150 men. You better be running the place right without too much unrest.
Exactly.
Or you're in trouble.
So with relation to the option to pay room and board, are there better cells that you can pay more for? Can you upgrade? Is there a?
I want a two bedroom. No.
Can I get an ensuite?
I wouldn't put it that way, but I will tell you this: that housing in prisons is driven by, not surprisingly, risk classification that assesses the relative risk of a prisoner in that setting, and then puts similar prisoners in the same housing.
Right.
You don't want to put a guy who's on the weak end of the spectrum, nonviolent, kind of soft, in a unit that's got the guys that are hard.
Sure.
So that's one thing, and the other thing is the degree of compliance and non-compliance. So if you're not compliant, you're going to get busted back into different housing units in the prison that are less comfortable, certainly, than where you go compliant. If there's not much range. I mean, it's not like they've got, 10 options, 15 options, but there is some.
Right.
And there's a whole nother discussion around this that just popped into my mind, where you've got guys in single cell, and they get classified up into single cell status for whatever non-compliance or for their original crime. They don't want to leave those cells. And so before they're reassessed,
because being in your own cell is better than sharing.
Well, it's private.
Yeah.
Privacy. I mean, there's nothing. The cacophony and of noise in a prison and lack of privacy, and you don't get to pick your roomie.
Yeah.
And so you got your stuff, right? I mean, you've seen enough movies, you can remember some of those scenes, right?
Yeah.
And so, just before that reassessment, you'll see a spike in incidents. The guys that want to leave, and so they do something that puts them in a non-compliant. Or the other reverse of it. This is more theoretical. I don't know that I could put my hands on any data on this, so I just say it more as an opinion. I wouldn't be surprised if the correctional officers as well, they don't want to see a prisoner that's compliant, been in a cell for a long time, move and leave and be replaced with some 19 or 20-year-old kid that's disrespectful and violent and difficult. So, they're more than happy to reassess an incident, which will keep the prisoner there. But I often said classification from lower custody to higher custody, from general population into single cell, et cetera, is a one-way elevator.
Huh,
It goes
right.
up.
Yeah, yeah,
And I was in the Michigan prison system, and we were crowded, and the single cells were all taken, and we had double cells that were filled. And I asked for classification, reclassification information, and found that they were only being reassessed for reclassification once a year. Well, my word, if you're going to get moved from a bay area into a single or a double cell, and you only get reassessed once a year, that elevator pretty much going one way. And then the percentage of reassessments that result in a lower custody level is slim. And these are the things that there's data, there's information, there's subjective information, interviews and whatnot that can tell you when you're in a prison system, what's happening across the board with these areas, and you can see the signs and the signals and the data when stuff starts to go in the wrong direction. A smart warden, and many of them are very impressed with a lot of their career stature and their intelligence, and they keep track of this stuff and they keep the lid on things. It's often, to me, it's a miracle that the thing works at all.
So is it like, obviously you take the reason you put the non-compliant people in a private cell is because they're dangerous to other people, but what a shame that that's also a reward. Like that's the incentives are reversed, right? If you behave badly, we're going to give you a nicer conditions.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't go too heavy with that. I mean, I don't want to. Single cell is no fun. I mean, the downsides, if you're in a single cell, you've also probably got restricted activity, so you may only get outside an hour a day. I mean, when you're in higher custody levels, it's a panoply of different things that are happening, and I just mentioned earlier one sliver of that being that there's privacy.
Okay. Thank you for
it's nothing that you necessarily aspire to, but if you've been in prison long enough and you're an old guy,
right,
and the young guys that are causing most of the trouble. I mean, the guys that cause most trouble in prisons many times are folks who are short-termers. They're in there for a short bit. They're not going to be there very long.
Right.
Their maximum sentence is such they know they're going to get out. They can't keep them there beyond their maximum sentence, and so those guys are ruling. Huh. You're an old guy, a lifer, wants to go along and get along, and this is your home.
Right.
You don't want to be around that, And so,
for sure,
it'd be fascinating to get a prisoner on the show.
Yeah.
A life, who's been in prison, and for he or she to describe all of this stuff, prove me true or prove me wrong. But my experience is based on talking to people and being there and watching it, and seeing it happen.
Yeah, being out here, it's hard to even fathom what all the incentive structures are going on in there.
Well, in Europe, it's a completely different system altogether. Depending on where you are, you've lived in Denmark for a while, so maybe a little bit about their prisons are run. They look like community college campuses.
Yeah.
I mean, they have really gone into a completely new era that the United States will never see anything like that in our lifetime. Of course, my lifetime is nearly as long as yours is going to be, but I don't know that it'll ever happen.
Yeah.
I don't know that it'll ever happen. I mean, we've talked so many times in so many different ways about the difficulty of getting these reforms to stick in a jurisdiction, in a prison, let alone a prison system, a state system, let alone the entire country. I mean, we're just so far gone. As I'm nearing retirement age, I've considered now and then, geez, what did you accomplish? And I'm feeling very positive about tens of thousands of prisoners that have benefited from the policies that I've helped change and shape. Mm-hmm. In terms of their life in prison and life after prison. So it's been helpful. But on the spectrum, on the perspective of whether or not the dial has really changed on the system itself, you see some pockets of it, but no, not really. And, and again, I mean, it's built on this principle of slavery.
Right.
And if that was outlawed for some pretty good reasons, we don't need to elucidate them. I mean, we're very clear about that. But those same kinds of things are going inside the prison system.
Yeah. I think we can assume our listeners are anti-slavery, so we don't need to go into those arguments.
Well, one of the things to consider too is where are prisons located, and why are they located there, and what relationship does that location have with the potential for them to leave the prison better prepared, Does the location of the prison have anything to do with that? And does that have any relationship with jobs in prison, et cetera? So many prisons are located in rural areas who clamored for the prison because of jobs.
Right.
And these are relatively dead-end jobs. There's a lot of studies that show that you put $1 into the prison system and it's not going to spring up a bunch of other jobs. You might have prisons and then you may need more parole officers, but it's not like a manufacturing job where as a result of manufacturing, you create warehouse jobs, you create transportation jobs to move the goods, you create wholesale and retail businesses to be able to sell the goods, et cetera, et cetera. That's productive money.
Yeah, well, right. It's a system where the better you do it, the fewer jobs there are. Right.
Right.
So again, there's another place where your incentive structures on the other side are flipped.
So you take prisoners who come from largely urban areas. It's a phenomenon that's, absolutely clear. Every state you're in, the major cities, there's data that you can look at that shows the percentage of prisoners that come from the urban centers are very high. In Michigan, back when I was working in the correction system, about 45% of all the prisoners in the system came from and returned to Detroit.
Right.
Well, there were only 2 prisons within driving distance of Detroit. The other prisons in Michigan, some were 5, 6, 8 hours away. Well, if you're in a rural setting up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and you're a Detroit kid and you're going to end up going back home, what happens when you're 5 or 6 hours away? Your family can't come to see you.
Sure.
It's too far of a trip. If you learned a skill up there, what would the applicability be in Detroit? If you graduated into some type of work release setting and you were a good worker and you picked up a skill up in the UP,
right?
How could that possibly have anything to do with the job in Detroit? One judge, I may have provided you this quote before, one judge said that when you take a prisoner from Detroit and you send him up to the UP for 10, 15-year sentence, you've given him a life sentence.
Yeah,
they will never recover from that.
Yeah, you've said that before, but it bears repeating. It's
Well, and think about this in relationship with the jobs and the pay. You're up in these rural regions. If you're in an urban setting and you're working in a prison, and that prison is located near a city, you've got all sorts of opportunities for engagement in that community from a business angle. Work release, preparation, et cetera, et cetera. Those things don't exist rurally. And it's, private prisons come into play as well here. It's a whole other topic. But
so if we put prisons closer to cities, this would have overall better outcomes, we think. And also, are prisons something where no one wants to have the prison nearby unless you're in the rural area and think there are jobs?
Well,
are people afraid of escapees or something? Or
the places that clamor for prisons are the places where unemployment is high. They tend to be more rural.
Right.
So the urban centers are not going to clamor, and they're likely to suffer more from the NIMBY principle, not in my backyard, NIMBY.
Yep.
And that's another reason why the prisons are built far further from the urban center. On the other side of that, though, is we've discussed, and somewhat obvious, the benefits of having a prison, if you're going to have one, have it closer to an urban center, if for no other reason. The proximity of prisoners to their families,
right,
is one of the single most critical factors that will lead toward more success. They've got to have that connection. If you break that off,
then
you don't make that workable. On things too, imagine this, that we had 55 prisons in Michigan when I was first here. We've got 30 some now, 29 maybe. I think they've closed 2 more. We ended up closing 20 prisons because of prisoner reentry and the reforms that we made internally. Pretty remarkable success story. But those prisons in those rural areas, boy, were those difficult to close because the legislators were up in arms of losing jobs. But it's difficult to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, and when we're looking at these different aspects of prisons where some are run better than others, there are always exceptions to the rule, and it's damn miserable when you think about how little the prison systems as a whole have actually changed over the past 100 years. I mean, it's good pockets and good examples of things that are happening very well, better reentry, et cetera, but so many places it's not touched them at all.
Next week on Seek Justice, we discuss the pros and cons of the privatization of prisons.
My position is that I don't want a private corporation running any type of a prison facility at all.
Okay.
If that prison facility includes the potential for gunfire or physical violence, which, of course, pretty much they all do.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you've just heard, you can support us by telling a friend or sharing us on social media. All of our episodes can be found on our website, seekjustice.fm. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we can be reached at seekjusticefm@gmail.com or via our Twitter account @seekjusticefm. See you next week.